Nadeem for his valuable contribution. My next speaker is Dr. Issam Sudani. Completed her doctorate in June 2014 in Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies at Durham University, UK. Her research focuses on the development of Muslim political theology since the First Muslim Civil War up to until the fall of the Ottoman Empire and the rise of the so-called modern political Islam. Dr. Issam's examination includes the development of concepts such as Caliphate, Imama, Hukum, and Sharia. Her research also looks at the methodology, the issues of methodology and various Quranic approaches. Recently, she finished a postdoctoral doctoral position at the Centre for Islam Christian Studies at Oxford. Dr. Issam was the researcher and assistant producer for Why Can't I Be a Sushi at the Spoken Irani's films. An independent production company working as a documentary exploring the Sunni-Shia conflict. She's a keen believer in social action and education, and also co-founder of the Elmi Center, an orphanage in Somalia. Her interests include Quranic hermeneutics. Sorry, I can't even read that. Post-colonialism, Muslim women, intellectual heritage, ideas surrounding ethnicity, race and culture, political theology, interfaith and inter- and intra-faith relations and community action. A proud dyslexic, believes in creativity and healing. She took a few months off to actively volunteer in the refugee crisis in Greece. Welcome Dr. Issam's contribution.
Assalamu alaikum, and peace and blessing to you all. It's fantastic to get a clap before actually speaking. I never could understand why people clap before you actually say something. Today, in my last 10 minutes, is I'm going to time myself and see if I can actually stick to 10 minutes. A kind of a semi-theology hat. So everything I'm going to talk about is mainly kind of putting a theological hat on and questions on how do we understand Islam, how do we understand Khilafah. And so which Khilafah are we talking about when we're talking about these kind of questions? Is it mutually exclusive between self-determination and the institution of Khilafah? Could you have one and not the other? And what does that self-determination mean? What makes a Khilafah Islamic? And this is a very crucial point. And other methodological questions, obviously that's very important, is what makes something binding? And this is, being a Muslim is a very important question. What makes something binding? I mean, what makes it wajib? It becomes binding to a Muslim to do. And again, how do we understand narratives passed down to us, and how much of it is it binding? And again, the questions that we're tackling today, as I was thinking about it and the debates, what kind of assumptions are we making by questions we're asking today? Who are we reacting towards? How does that reaction formulate our own response and identity? In this very short presentation, it's necessarily important to examine the relationship of Islam and politics. From the very early Muslim generations and their understanding of revelation with the political events at the time. There seems a common understanding that Islam and the state, whatever that is, have always been merged together in harmony. Looking at some historical event, this seems far from the truth. What I'm interested in to look at in the few minutes I have is this relationship. How did we end up talking about the Caliphate as a homogeneous entity, as an institution, as an identity, as an ideal to be either implemented or thought of as a golden age? If we translated the Khilafah to the common translation of Islamic State, which is slightly very problematic, how did we end up in this transition? How did this transition happen? What modern challenges are we reacting towards that made concepts such as Islamic State being adopted? Now, I'd like to really emphasize that there is a real departure from the so-called groups that are calling themselves Daesh, and you've heard from earlier conversations about this, and a real departure from this from the early political theology. Although in my thesis I did make it an argument that the modern Daesh are the new Kharijites. I've come to question my own position after talking to real eyewitnesses living under Daesh in places like Deir ez-Zor in Syria. And we can talk about that later, in kind of how they were treated. It is really mind-boggling how, even for themselves, because they're Muslims too, to even call the people that are calling Islamic State as Islam, it's so far away from anything Islamic. So the early theopolitical debates were based on questions of designation, leadership, and who had the right to succeed the Prophet after him. Not in the prophetic succession sense, but in political leadership sense. I don't think Muslims have survived the schisms that developed after this first civil war, and this is between the assassination of the companion of the Prophet, Uthman bin Affan, and the assassination of another companion, Ali bin Abi Talib. And obviously the development of Kharijites, and as a first group who actively decided it is legitimate to rebel against the leader, they would declare to be unjust, and therefore kafir. And this is the first time in Muslim thinking that the boundaries of belief have drawn. Who's a Muslim, who's not a Muslim, and therefore the consequences of that. Khawarij were the first group to actively bring about these kind of questions by their violence. The issue here is not just the ideas proposed by Khawarij, of course, but actions that taken that led to violence between Muslims, and this is for the first time Muslims killing Muslims. That was very new and in effect led to a series of development of theological discussions on the concept of God's justice, imamah, and to what extent is it determined by God himself, and the implementation of God's law, hukum, that later became synonymous with Sharia. In fact, the development of theology, as we know it today, was based on crucial questions of God's nature of God's word, the debate on predestination and free will, that developed first by Murji'ites as a reaction to the Kharijites, and later by the Ash'ari, and the counter-argument between Mu'tazili and Shia. What concerns me in the so-called Caliphate debate is its oversimplification. Nowadays we're hearing of the understanding of the early political debates, the theological questions that developed since the schisms, the nature of hadith and the reason for its collection, and the contemporary debate about Sharia. The historical implementation of Sharia, its tension and relationship with the worldly political authorities have never been merged in the way it is perceived today. Just to mention that 3 out of 4 founders of jurisprudential schools were jailed or tortured. So this idea that state and politics have merged so closely as an institution, I would argue is a myth within our Muslim history. And this is obviously an indication of complexity of the relationship between worldly powers and the religious institutions in early Muslim and medieval period. The mythological narrative that somehow political authorities were in great harmony with Sharia is just difficult to substantiate. Of course, it was important to be seen pro-Sharia due to public image, but just to give the example of the Inquisition period, the Mihna, for example, the Abbasi Khalif al-Ma'mun and his obsession with the debate whether the Quran was created or eternal is, of course, one of those frictional examples of torturing scholars such as Ahmad bin Hanbal, Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal, to force him to declare the word of God is actually created. Of course, he didn't and stood his ground. These debates, however, have real hermeneutical consequences on how certain understanding is binding, eternal, universal, and relevant. Another example is, of course, the way Muawiyah shifted the entire precedence of leadership into monarchical type. What does that tell us about Caliphate? Which historical period is it binding? Doesn't that tell us that there are multi-layered realities of the so-called Caliphate and not all of them seem to me Quranic? Whatever definition Caliphate ends up being, because I think it's extremely problematic to define Caliphate for some reason as a political entity, whereas early on when the first, if you call Khalifa, he was called Khalifa as successor of the Prophet. So he succeeded the Prophet in the meaning of succession. And how did that term shift into something very different, into kind of a institution? Let me turn to the concept of Sharia very quickly. What does Sharia mean? It's not a law manual that has everything and things are clear. Just for a second, take out the idea that the state, whatever that is, needs to implement Sharia. In effect, what Sharia has become to mean is a mujtahid, a jurist, giving or making law, being a judge, i.e., a person that needs to look at all evidence, see all circumstances, the context and the sources available to make a reasonable judgment. A judgment that should be just, moral, proportionate, and fair. Now, look into the Quran. Fiqh is also mentioned, but not in jurisprudential sense, but in the meaning of understanding. For example, in the verse, قُلُوبٌ لَا يَفْقَهُونَ بِهَا, hearts that do not understand. But even if we equated God's law, حكم Allah, with fiqh, that is, hukm becomes fiqh, jurisprudence, and made the argument that following fiqh would equate to God's law and therefore to Sharia, the human infallibility cannot be taken away. In fact, the early scholars, when they gave any verdict or judgment of law, i.e. fatwa, they always say God knows best, and indeed He does. They know the contextual nature of fatwa, and that there is always a human element in understanding something, because we're all limited. It's that acknowledgement that we're all missing today. Furthermore, the fact there are many different schools of jurisprudence suggests that whatever law implemented by a state must be flexible to include the diversity of opinion, factors and context. Of course, you get fanatics. It's those fanatics obscure the understanding of Sharia. To me, Sharia is a pathway towards spiritual elevation, equality between all beings, proportionality, and the right of the less fortunate. Justice, ethical finance. In fact, the consideration of morality and ethics in any verdicts is one of the foundations of Sharia. If you ask me if I want all the above to be part of the fabric of law making, I would not hesitate to say yes. But unfortunately, nowhere does Sharia mean justice in our Turkey today. It's this kind of colonization of our thought that we need to reclaim. So now, you think I'm oversimplifying, drawing a big picture. The issue isn't about Sharia. The issue is about those that understand it, study it, and implement it. The issue is about mixing of concepts such as fiqh, hukm, and Sharia. It's about spiritual beings that have not grounded themselves in the spirit of God, but rather in the nafs, in the ego. I would also suggest to decolonize our thoughts from the early Orientalist discussions of how Caliphate is spoken and researched by likes of Gibbs, who ended up shaping the debate, narrative and research. His work, I suggest, in researching into Muslim theopolitical heritage misses the sectarian debate and paints a Caliphate theory that is homogeneous. Self-determination for me is to understand our history, the debates, the discussions, the disagreements on what theologians were discussing in the earlier medieval period. Self-determination for me is not to be reactive, fragile, and getting rid of inferiority complexes we have developed. Self-determination is still being part of the world that contributes positively without constantly feeling the need to turn back to a golden age of Islam that is complex and has multi-layered realities. Self-determination is to be Imam Ghazali, to be Rabi' al-Adawiyya, Nafisa bint al-Hasan, al-Darda, Fatima al-Juzdaniya, to be Imam Shafi'i, to be Ibn Sina, to be Farabi. So, I want to leave you with this thought. In my early years in university, a question constantly bothered me, looking at the extremely bloody periods of Muslim history and looking at people like Hassan al-Basri, Rabi' al-Adawiyya. And the question in my mind was, why is it none of those people had any known statement and discussions in early debates of leadership or imamah? And I mention those two because they are, I inspire towards them. They really are great people. And because they lived in the same time as these movements and violence was happening. So the question is, why was there silence amongst people so great like them? I feel the older I'm getting, the more I can understand and appreciate the silence. It requires being grounded, firm, and spiritually elevated, not to be touched by debates that that if you get sucked down by will frame an identity that misses the point of the message itself. In other words, being self-determined is not in the institution, but in the actual act of being, in the act of spiritual training and growth. It's in the presence of the self-reflection, self-training, and self-observation that we can truly be self-determined and transcend the narrative forced on us from all sides, both on a personal level and on the public, and especially in such hard times we live in today. Thank you.